With any luck, the heavens will stay closed for a few minutes for us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Elgin. Welcome to our fair city in celebration of the nation's centennial. 100 years of progress, 100 years of celebration in industry and commerce, 58 years of glory as a state, 41 years as a thriving commercial center. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in an age of energy and enterprise and progress. As we stand here today, thousands of our countrymen are gathered in Philadelphia for the 1876 Centennial Exposition, celebrating amazing achievements in industry and progress. Cities with 9-story buildings, inventions of all sorts. And now we learn that the great territory of Colorado will be joining us as the 40th state. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Benjamin Wright Raymond. And although I was not born in Elgin, I was born in Rome, New York in 1801. I spent 40 years of my life interacting with the people of this great town and building its industry and commerce. When I was born, Thomas Jefferson was the 3rd president of the United States. There were 16 states in the Union, and 5 million people made up our population. As a young man, I trained as a surveyor and a merchant and a clerk. I had to learn on my own, though. For the most part, my poor mother met her reward when I was but 5 years of age. My father passed away when I was a young man of 22. But as a young man, I met one of the great revivalists of all time, Reverend Finney, a great Presbyterian, a great believer. A man who taught me to value religion and who taught me to value temperance. A man who turned me into a new light and saved me from being a lost soul. I was fortunate enough in 1835 to marry my beloved Miss Amelia Porter. Shortly after, we moved to Chicago to seek our fortune, to seek opportunity as a merchant. But alas, in 1837, the panic set in. Our money was no good, and our family went $20,000 in debt. Folks, we were as poor as Job's turkey. In spite of everything, by 1838, we turned our attention to Elgin. Across lots, through adversity, we began to build the first of our series of businesses here. It was a turning point, an almighty undertaking. I never owned a house in Elgin that I lived in, but I've been involved here for years and years. Since 1839, we opened up our first store at the southwest corner of DuPage in Center Street with my brother-in-law, Samuel Newton Dexter, who supplied the capital. Samuel's a fine man, a good business partner. And in 1842, we opened up a cobblestone store, a solid little store of stone that lasted 15 years. We built that at the southeast corner of Spring Street and Chicago. There were no liquor sales at either store, though, so we ran no groggery. Lovers of Old Orchard were not welcome at our store. No, sir. Other groceries in town, the young men of town would enter and come out all flustered and unable to walk. They looked like they were walking a Virginia fence. The young men who came into our store came out sober and industrious and walked a straight line. In 1844, again with Mr. Dexter, we opened up a woolen mill 5 stories tall, one of the largest buildings in town. And later, partners with Augustus Adams, we built a foundry on South River Street, made corn shellers, one of the most practical and useful inventions for man or beast alike. We later built a tannery at Brook Street and North Street. Some folks know and remember that several years ago, a gentleman named Gale Borden converted that building into a condensing plant for milk. But in spite of these successes in business, and against the teachings of God and common sense and my dear wife Amelia, I ran for mayor of Chicago. Politics. I should have minded my own funeral, but instead embarked upon the backing and filling of politics, a world for which I was not really prepared. They elected me anyway. 1839, I was the third mayor of the city of Chicago, a Whig, a man of strong principles. And after 1840, I got out. 2 years later, my friends convinced me that they had to have a compromise candidate. We ran as a Democrat, and unfortunately, I won again. I've got to tell you, though, the Whigs are pretty tough. I don't think the Democrats are going to last long in Chicago politics. While mayor, though, we did help establish the lakefront park system. We helped the poor indigent Irish canal workers, folks who'd been put out of jobs when the Illinois and Michigan Canal had such difficulty. And most of all, while mayor, I saw the value of the railroad. Ladies and gentlemen, the Iron Horse, the railroad, will change America. Amelia and I talked, looked at our struggling businesses, and finally acknowledged the corn. We left the Chicago merchant business to more able men, big bugs like John Farwell and Marshall Field. We brought the railroad to Elgin in 1850. The Iron Horse began to change the town almost immediately. By 1854, I was the president of that railroad, the Fox River Valley Railroad, and we commenced running lumber. We had a line that went from Elgin all the way north to Geneva Lake, Wisconsin, the gateway to lumber country, the gateway to lumber country that would help build the city of Elgin. And I'll tell you, progress is a wonderful thing. 2 years later, in 1856, one of our engines ran from Chicago to Elgin full chisel at speeds in excess of 25 miles per hour. Can you believe that? Imagine 2 hours and 9 minutes from Elgin to Chicago and Chicago to Elgin. Unbelievable progress. Someday folks will do that on a regular basis. Well, progress came and progress went. By 1864, our railroad was bought by a bigger one, a big bug railroad named the Chicago and Northwestern. By 1864, though, we were in the middle of a great war. The Civil War had torn our nation apart, would cost the lives of over 600,000 Americans before it ended. Millions of wounded men, battlefields shattered and destroyed hundreds of towns and villages north and south, destroyed thousands of homes. It was a great national catastrophe. Ladies and gentlemen, the railroad rebuilt this great nation. Inventors came up with wonderful things, circular saws, machines that would plane lumber to build homes and businesses. Balloon frame construction became common all over the Midwest. It rebuilt Chicago after its horrible fire of 5 years ago. And now Elgin is rebuilding after the several fires we've recently had. Ladies and gentlemen, the railroad is changing this nation. Why, do you realize here today in 1876, over 25% of the population of this country now live in urban areas? Amazing. In 1853, a fellow named Otis invented this gizmo called an elevator. Other people came up with a way to make steel beams, and now you can build higher and higher up into the sky. Just last year in 1875 in New York City, they built a building 9 stories tall, 260 feet up into the air. It's a wonderment. Well, strangely enough, 5 years ago in 1871, a fellow from New York named Frederick Law Olmsted began building a newfangled thing called a suburb. They started in Riverside. It's a place, and I don't know if I can believe it, but it's a place where folks live and then take the carriageway or the train into work. Why, they've got a railroad depot right outside of the suburb. It's amazing. Most of all, though, the railroad and its prosperity allowed us here in Elgin to form the Elgin National Watch Company. Well, I was president of that from 1864 to 67 before I hung up my fiddle and began my retiracy. But I remained a director of that fine company, and I will as long as I can. The Elgin National Watch Company has created a lot of jobs for this town, and we appreciate what it's done for Elgin. Folks, we live in an age of progress and energy. Commerce and industry flourishes in Elgin. We are a young nation now of some 45 million people, triple what it was when I was born. Some folks say the city of Chicago will actually reach 1 million residents. The Iron Horse might allow some folks to actually live in Elgin and go into the city of Chicago to work. Can you imagine? They've got inventions now like the Pullman Palace car and refrigerator cars and dining cars where you can sit down to a meal on the railroad on your way into the city. Progress. Well, folks, President Grant and Vice President Henry Wilson have led us to the brink of the future. We're finally putting that great war behind us. The last occupation troops are leaving South Carolina and Louisiana and Florida. But we've got an important election coming up. And pay attention to this because this is an important thing. In the last election of General Grant, only 71% of our population turned out to vote. Only 71% of those folks that were eligible to cast a ballot, as is their right and privilege, showed up to vote. That is terrible. Whether you vote for Hayes or for Tilden, show up at the polls. November's a-coming. Well, we've got some good news too. The financial crisis of 1873 seems to be easing a little bit, and Elgin is starting to rise. Elgin now has a library of over 2,000 volumes with which to educate our children. Gas lights and water mains, a fire department, Elgin High School, and our oldest school, Elgin Academy. Well, you know, I've been a trustee of Elgin Academy now for 22 years. I've seen a strong, learned faculty and earnest, enterprising students. Elgin Academy is a school which prospers today and will for decades to come. Elgin has the finest schools. Come to Elgin for a good education. It's a great place to work and bring a family to live. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and enjoy our fair city.
It is with open arms and a little bit of pride that I welcome you this afternoon to Bluff City Cemetery. I am John B. Newcomb, Elgin's most influential early educator and important record keeper. I was a self-made scholar who spent my life's passion helping to preserve the legacy of Elgin, the city that I loved. And indeed, if I had not, many of the lives of the men and women buried here would have been lost to the annals of history, and your very surroundings might be very different than you see here today. I was born July 1st, 1824 in New York State and migrated to Kendall County with my parents as a young boy. I received very little formal education but quickly developed a passion for learning, especially history. Sadly, in 1840, I was orphaned and I dealt with the tragedy by coming to Elgin and taking my first teaching position at a small country school just east of town. The humble vocation of country school teacher paid handsome dividends, however, as it led to the introduction to the family of my bride-to-be, Aruthaza Gould, whom I married in 1850 at the age of 26. We were blessed with 2 children, one a boy who sadly died at childbirth, but a second was my daughter Fonetta. In 1851, I took my first teaching position in the city of Elgin at the Old Pioneer School on West Chicago Street, and later founded my own private school also on Chicago Street. I was known as a passionate teacher who demanded the most of his students, enforced discipline with a 2-foot ruler, and expected my students to bring their utmost effort to the classroom every day. More than one Elginite can tell you the famous story of the famous Kimball family from Elgin's early years, and a young Walter Kimball who I sent home to his father one day with all of his books in tow. When his father inevitably asked him why he had brought all his books home on the same day, I had dictated young Walter's reply. "Mr. Newcomb says he's ashamed to take your money because I am wasting his time and mine." In 1856, I became one of the first 4 original faculty members of the Elgin Academy, teaching natural science, penmanship, teacher training, and phonography. Phonography was an early form of shorthand, which I was so famous for that I named my daughter Phonetta. In 1860, I became superintendent of Elgin schools and later superintendent for the entire county. In the years that follow, I served as sexton or recorder for the city of Elgin and the old Elgin Cemetery on Channing Street, where I showed how forward-thinking I was by ordering no smoking signs to be posted throughout the cemetery. Perhaps my most important legacy for Elgin, however, is the written record that I left to historians of the future that was invaluable in piecing together a framework of Elgin's earliest years. Indeed, I was legendary for my marginal notes that I put in the margins of my records, and your historians of your day, like E.C. Alfs, can testify to the value of those notes in reconstructing the important events of Elgin's history. I also collected a collection of early biographies of important Elginites that later became the basis of a book by what is now the Elgin Historical Society. And my love of genealogy was private as well as public, as I spent many years of my life constructing a 500-page genealogical memoir of the Newcomb family name in America from 1635 through 1874. But my most immediate, evident contribution to the Elgin community is what you see around here, and my role in designing the Bluff City Cemetery is between 1885 and 1889 as the sexton of the Bluff City Cemetery. My philosophy in doing so was most concisely and most appropriately captured by a newspaper article at the time, which quoted me as saying this: "A cemetery should be full of surprises. It should not be regular nor stiff. There should not be 2 gravestones in a line, nor a systematic arrangement of roads. For if it served the appearance of the grounds to have the road run around a tree, it should do so." I'd passed on in 1897 at the age of 73, but was survived by my loving bride, Aruthaza. But my spirit and passion for history and genealogy should always be remembered. And indeed, you should all take away with you a lesson today, and that is to remember and record the lives of your loved ones, as well as I sought to preserve the legacy of mere strangers from Elgin, the city that I loved. Thank you very much.
Oh,
Good afternoon. Logan, how are you?
well, thank you for coming. I'm glad you stopped to see me. One of the volunteers today gave me the morning paper, and I was just reading about these hurricanes, this Katrina and Rita. I guess we can't complain if we get a little wet today. Doesn't it make you aware of how fast your life can change, that you can go from prosperity to being homeless overnight? And isn't that what happened to the victims of Katrina and Rita? I've been thinking about them a lot before you came. Well, I've waited 18 years to tell my story. Over the years, I've heard some of my neighbors talk, and I'm so glad to give you a chance to stop by and hear what I contributed to Elgin. I think that when you hear some of the things that I started here and things that have continued, you'll see how generous our community is, and I'm glad to see that some of it continues today. I was born Louise Kerber, Edna Louise Kerber, and I'm here with my family. The Kerber meatpacking business was started by my great-grandfather, Charles Kerber. My father there is Charles. His father was the pioneer in the meatpacking business. And the Kerber Packing Company was our family business. In fact, my husband ended up going into that business and eventually becoming vice president of the company. Now, I was born here in 1891 and passed away in 1972. And I point that out because in my obituary in 1972, it stated that I lived for 91 years instead of 81 years. And can you imagine adding 10 years to a lady's age? Well, let me tell you, there was a correction the next day in the local paper, and I appreciate that. Now, I can tell you that in 1909, after I went to Elgin High School and attended the Groton School for Girls in the North Shore and made lots of friends over there in the Phi Gamma Phi sorority, that I ended up marrying John Logan from Elgin. But that wouldn't tell you the whole story. So I brought a copy of my wedding announcement. If you see, it's a long story. It was news because a society couple eloped. And well, I'll tell you what happened. On Saturday, July 31st in 1909, John, who had just finished his freshman year at the University of Illinois and was working as a clerk in the Kane County Board of Review, told his fellow clerks that he might not return to work that afternoon, and that was true. Now, I was at home telling my parents that I was going to go visit a friend, which was true. We met up, we drove to Downers Grove, we got a marriage license, and were married that afternoon. Well, we saw the wisdom of letting our parents know, and we didn't have weather channels or cell phones or instant communications that you have today. Whoops. I'm very protective of this. The folks at Sherman Hospital will not like that. That was my uniform for my lifetime of service there. Anyway, what we did was we had hid the news from my parents. In fact, I'll read what it says in this news article. Their actions were so guarded that no suspicion was aroused, and the parents, as well as friends of the couple, were completely surprised by the announcement contained in the telegram, which was received by the parents of the bride in the evening. So my parents received, and his parents, a telegram saying we were married. Now, we honeymooned in Chicago and returned on Sunday evening, but the newspaper ran the story on Monday that we emphatically denied that the reason we eloped was because I had made a pledge with my sorority sisters that all of us would marry by elopement. And I will tell you, there are some secrets that should go to the grave with you. Now, we went on with our young married lives, and we moved in with John's parents first. He later went into my family business. In 1912, we lost a son, John Logan III. We went on to have a daughter, Mary Louise, named after me, and everything was going well. During World War I, during the 1920s, it was a bright time for the country in the late 20s, as well as Elgin. The watch factory and many businesses were bringing prosperity to town. In 1929, a 15-story skyscraper opened in downtown Elgin, a symbol of prosperity. In fact, last year, the Tower Building, as it's called today, celebrated the 75th year, and I understand we're going to shine a light on that soon as a symbol of prosperity in downtown Elgin again. But that building, within a few years, was only at 1/5 capacity because the economy was so bad. And people in Elgin were standing in line. Unemployment was yielding all sorts of lines for food, and homeless. And what happened was in 1930, when I was 39, and you see my parents passed away in 1930 and 31. It was a bleak time in my personal life also. But the associated charities in the area combined to the Family Welfare Association, and for 4 years without pay, I served as a director and helped the homeless and the needy in Elgin. We started things like a canteen in the basement of the Salvation Army, which opened Thanksgiving Day in 1931, that served vegetable stew to people in need, including school children who were showing up undernourished at school. The Courier News started a shoe fund, something that continues today, a fundraiser to buy shoes for children who can't go to school without shoes. So we started many services to help the needy. And in 1934, after some federal money came into town to help with relief and start building us back, I was able to step back from direct service and serve as president of the Family Welfare Association for the next 12 years. Now, Mike Alft, who was one of my former mayors in the 1960s, you might run into him. He's now a historian, I understand, and he wrote a book called Elgin and American History. And here's what he says about Elgin in the 30s. Elgin was prostrate during the 30s. Statistics do not reveal the personal effects of the Depression, of marriages postponed, of vanished savings, of hopes of higher education crushed, of the feeling of helplessness and uselessness, of those without jobs and the jungles of homeless men in the gravel pits southeast of town. The wolf was at the door. And I think probably today in Texas and Louisiana, there are people that are feeling that the wolf was at the door. Now, I brought along a picture of myself because I thought you'd enjoy seeing how lovely I was. And I mention that because this was in a 1940s publication of the Fox Valley that said that I was the Valley's one of the loveliest and most useful women. Well, I agree with that, if you notice my picture. In 1940, it noted that at 6 years prior, I had been the first woman to receive the Distinguished Public Service Award from the Cosmopolitan Club here in Elgin for my work during the 1930s, the Depression. And also that our daughter at that time was in Finch College in New York City. Now, I don't know if you can see this, but down here there's a picture of two Louise Logans. One is a horse. Colonel Edward Baker of St. Charles had a thoroughbred farm, raised horses on Red Gate Farm, and is honoring me for my service in the Fox Valley, promised me, because I loved horses, that he would name a colt after me. So there I am with Louise Logan. Now, during World War II, I served in Elgin and the county as the American Red Cross Blood Bank Chair. I served in a lot of organizations, including the YWCA, helped with their camp. I was a lifetime member. And this is the uniform that we wore in the 40s and the 50s when we volunteered at Sherman Hospital. I wear my Sherman service pin. I was active in the community chest drive for more than 35 years. Today, that's the United Way of Elgin. Now, in 1957, I was awarded the Altrusa Woman of the Year Award, sort of a lifetime achievement. And that night at the YWCA dinner, one of the people joining me was Myrtle Huff. And if you know Elgin, you know that about 3 or 4 blocks from here, straight north, is Huff Elementary School, named after my friend. So it's not that I was the only woman providing service in education and social services here in town. Now, I passed on in 1972 following my husband's death in 1967. He had retired from the Kerber Packing Company as vice president. And I was given private services here for my family, but also at First Congregational Church, there was a memorial service for me. And in tribute to my service, Dr. Willis Reed of First Baptist joined Dr. Dalrymple of the First Congregational Church. It was a nice service. Before you leave, I'd like to point out some things happened in my life that have happened in yours. In 1956, America became an all-American city. And I hear that in 2002, that happened to Elgin again, and that's great. I think that's wonderful. The Sherman Hospital is serving the east side of Elgin, but I know they plan to move west to Big Timber and Randall Road as they expand to a growing community. The Community Crisis Center is celebrating the 30th year in helping the homeless and the disadvantaged. You have a PADS organization that serves on a daily basis. And yes, they still give the Altrusa Woman of the Year Award for recognizing service. So I encourage you, whether it's volunteering or writing a check to Katrina, to the Salvation Army, to Red Cross, or to a local agency, please go forward and be useful. Thank you.
And I'm going to be the pilot of this section of the tour for you. So if you have any emergencies, you can exit this way and follow your guide. Mrs. Flax will show you the way. And an emergency could be weather or just me going on too long, which is probably the bigger of the risk. My name is Dick Peck. I was born in 1896. I was born to Mr. and Mrs. George Peck. The Peck family was known in Elgin for Peck's Department Store. In 1920, the Peck Department Store was damaged in the Palm Sunday tornado, and it was bought by a man named Mr. Joseph Spies. And my father got out of the business, and the Spies name then became prominent in Elgin. I led a fairly normal young life. My family was fairly prominent and wealthy, as I said. I graduated Elgin High School, and I went to a college in Wisconsin. I was all on that course of a, upper middle class life until two things happened in 1922 and 1923. The first in 1922, I took my first flying lesson. And the second, much more tragic, in 1923, my wife died in childbirth, and both my wife and child died. I threw myself into aviation, and by 1925, I had the highest license that anybody could get in the United States, a pilot of commerce. That meant I could fly anything, any place, anywhere. And in 1925 to 1926, I left Elgin for Dutch New Guinea. Now, if you don't know where Dutch New Guinea is, all you have to do is put your finger on Elgin, draw a line right before you fall off the face of the earth, and it's right there. It's right off of Australia. It's an island, the second largest island in the world, half the size of the eastern United States. The problem is that this huge island has never been charted, had never been visited. No one had any idea what was there. The Sterling Expedition of 1925 and 1926, 20-month period, we would go into the middle of this island and do scientific discoveries. It cost $700,000 in 1925-26, so someone was serious about it. That was a lot of money, and well, still a lot of money, but it was a lot more then. What I would do as the pilot is I was the supply line. We would have a base camp. And I would take supplies and everything that was needed for the expedition into the interior of the island. We'd go to outposts and they would take us samples. And every sample, everything we found was of some value, either being biological, zoological, botanical. Everything we brought back, the thousands of samples we brought back, were distributed around universities, and they were a great boon to the scientific studies. We spent a lot of time with the natives. I was amazed on what I saw there. I saw birds I'd never seen before. I saw flowers and plants that I had no idea in my mind existed. And we spent a lot of time with the natives. And these natives were little pygmies. And I don't mean to be, I was just surprised at a pygmy. I had no idea what a pygmy was. It's a 4-foot person, tribes of them. And they were as confused by me as I was by them. But by the end of the tour, by the end of the expedition, we had grown to trust each other. They still wouldn't come near my plane. They had no idea what it was, this big iron bird that flew out of the sky, but they trusted me. We shared meals, and we ate kangaroo, and we ate wild boar, and we ate the native fauna and the plants and vegetables. And I shot 21,000 feet of film, and I brought it back. And in 1926, the Courier News interviewed me as an article, and they asked me, what was I going to do next? I'm a 33-year-old man. I'm a pilot. I'm adventurous. What am I going to do next? And I said, I don't know, but I'm not going back to New Guinea. A year later, I go back to New Guinea. The U.S. government had hired me and a small group of scientists to look for a disease-resistant sugarcane. Now the flights in here were, I did more of them. I did about 30 flights at about 10,000 miles, which doesn't seem like a lot. When you think about it, Lindbergh had just crossed the Atlantic the year before. So I was doing a flying that was the seat of your pants flying. I was flying over huge mountains. I was going to forests that you couldn't see the ground. And when you could see the ground, you couldn't see the ground because the fog was so thick. It was a uncharted, difficult place to fly, and I was successful. And there were a couple of times, if you fly too high in a mountain area, ice forms on your wings and you'll crash. You fly too low and you fly into a mountain and you crash. So either option is not good. The margin of error was so small, but we succeeded. I came back from that, and I knocked around Elgin for a little bit. I would give flying lessons at the local Elgin Airport, and I would hook up with an airplane called the Blue Streak. I was hired as a co-pilot, and the Blue Streak was owned by the Chicago Daily News. Now today, the Chicago Daily News' last paper of the day would be called the Blue Streak, so they called the plane that. They used us for publicity, and we used them for funding, and what we were funding for was endurance testing. We were taking a certain amount of freight, moving to a certain point at the quickest time. We were trying to set some land records. Well, this plane, the Blue Streak, I hated. It was a bulky plane, it was experimental, it had no tail section. It had 2 engines. Instead of both working together, one would push and one would pull. It was kind of a 2 different kind of propulsion. It didn't fly, it lumbered. On May 26th, we got in our plane, we're going to try our first leg of this speed record. Tried to take off, it was too heavy. Unloaded 700 pounds of fuel. Tried again, we're off. Plane's lumbering along. It's flying very slowly. We finally get to where we want. And I traveled the world. I'd gone to New Guinea, as I told you. I traveled, all told, about 20,000 miles into this dark, uncharted island. And 18 miles from my home, we would crash and I would die. Witnesses said the plane, the wing, fell off. And with all the weight, it just spiraled into the ground and hit the ground with such an impact that it was buried 4 feet into the dirt. Our bodies were mangled. We were killed instantly. And the only way they made the initial identification on me is they went to my coat and they pulled out my pocket watch, my aviator watch, and they saw that it was engraved to me. And eventually they made all the identifications of how they knew it was me originally. Now some of you may think that I died too young at age 35, and I often told friends I had an adventurous life. And I knew that one day they probably would have to pull me out of a crash. But up to that point, that the plane hit the ground, being the pilot that I was, I thought I could pull that plane out. I thought I could somehow bring it in. I flew doing what I loved to the very end of my life. And I guess a good epitaph would be for me, would be that Dr. Brandeis from the Sterling Expedition, they said that the expedition succeeded not only as my skills as a pilot, but my goodness as a man. Thank you very much.
Willkommen. My name is Kasper Alsen. My grave is over there. I was born in Hockelheim, Germany, and came alone to the United States at the age of 15 and emigrated to a state that appreciates good beer, Wisconsin. I worked in brewery up there at Three Rivers, and then in 1868 I came down into Elgin and bought the James Tazewell Brewery on the west side of the river above the dam. That Tazewell Brewery began here in Elgin in 1849. When I bought the Tazewell Brewery, I went into partnership with Paul Duntz, who also had a brewery here. And then Duntz left in 1870, and I formed Kasper Alsen and Company. I arrived in Elgin at a good time to make beer. Germans were pouring in from the old country before and after the Franco-Prussian War, particularly from the Kingdom of Hanover, because the Prussians, after they had conquered Hanover, a country that unfortunately sided with the Austrians, were going to put all those Hanoverians into the Prussian army, and so they came to Elgin instead. By the turn of the century, about 25% of our population here in Elgin was born in Germany. We had 4 German language churches, a German newspaper, and of course the Kasper Alsen Brewery. By 1880, we were sending 80 barrels of beer into local saloons alone. By 1890, we were producing about 4,000 to 5,000 barrels a day. 10,000 bushels of barley, 5,000 pounds of malt. And then in the 90s, we expanded our plant to the north into stone buildings. And by 1898, we were bottling the beer, which we called Adlerbrau, or Eagle beer, Adler being eagle in Germany and Brau being beer. We shipped all over northern Illinois, but of course all 30 and more saloons here in Elgin were good customers. Making beer is like making bread. We use grain and yeast and water. We seep the grain into water and pure water until it germinates, and then after a while we age it, and beginning in '98 we bottled it. Our business expanded, so our capacity was 50,000 barrels, but we generally did not produce more than 25,000 barrels. And then, as the years went by, those Methodists got interested in prohibition. In 1914, the women of Elgin said they were disgusted with having their husbands come home loaded with Alsen's Eagle Brew and leaving their paychecks at the saloons. They couldn't do much about it until 1913, when the state legislature gave them the right to vote. Oh. So in 1914, they voted to dry up all 34 saloons in Elgin Township, and there went our market. We tried making near beer, and we were shipping beer to other points in northern Illinois outside of the Elgin Township boundaries. Fortunately, there's always Hanover Township, where the Germans were predominant. That's where we're located now. And up there in Dundee, those River Street saloons in East Dundee remained our good customers all the way down to 1919, when national prohibition took place. We closed up the brewery on March 8th, 1919. My sons took over after I died in 1896. Well, all those vats and copper kettles and tubing were very attractive to bootleggers. And so in 1921, the Althans sold out to a firm called Elgin Ice and Beverage Company. They said they were going to make root beer, but no, they were turning out good 4% alcohol beer, just like in the old days. Then in 1923, the Prohibition agents raided it twice, in March and then in August. In August, they waited until 2 big Mack trucks pulled out of the brewery, loaded, and they chased them down South State Street firing shots. One truck got away and the other they cornered. Well, that was the end. They came in and with mauls and hatchets chopped up everything. And that, for the most part, was the end of the business I established with Paul Dunsett back in 1868. What became of the brewery? I'd like to show you a picture of how it looked at its height. It stretched across along the west bank of the Fox River. And it was purchased by Woodruff and Edwards in 1927 because they had enough of their workers going over to the brewery at noon and then coming back splotched. And for a while, during the 30s, it was a home for the transients and homeless. It was a center for Mexico City at the time. And finally, in 1963, they bulldozed the last of the brewery. Now I'd like to conclude with a favorite poem. I think that I shall never hear a poem lovelier than beer. That brew that saloons have on tap, with golden base and snowy cap, the foamy stuff I drink all day until my memory melts away. Fools make poems, I fear, but only Althan can make a beer.
Well, welcome. As people sit down, my name is John Spencer Adams. You caught me deep in thought as I was pondering a major decision in my life. The year is 1882. I'm 48 years old, and as you can tell, I'm a rather successful watchmaker and inventor. But that was an important decision I made in my life, but before I tell you what I decided, I'll back up and tell you about 2 other important milestones in my life. The first one occurred in 1861. It wasn't so much a decision as one that was made for me. I was conscripted into the Union Army in the 38th Massachusetts Infantry. Up until that point, I had lived in and around Waltham, Massachusetts. I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1834. During school in that time, I met a girl who became my childhood sweetheart, who I eventually married, Fanny Smith, who's buried here next to me. During that time, we had 11 children, 9 of whom lived to adulthood, some of whom are here helping me. You can see them around. Went into the watchmaking business with my younger brother, Oscar, and worked for various watch companies, which were mostly centered in Massachusetts at that time. The Howard Watch Company and then the Waltham Watch Company. But in 1861, I went into the Army, and I was quickly discovered by my superiors as somebody who was very inventive and creative and could solve problems. And because of that, I had several very interesting assignments during the Civil War. First one was I was assigned, taken out of the infantry and assigned to General Butler in New Orleans. He had recently occupied that city and it needed to be rebuilt, and I was assigned to do that for him. It's kind of something that we're experiencing today in a different way. Did that very successfully, and then I was reassigned to Washington, D.C., where I was in charge of the entire Union arsenal. And while there, I had several inventions be taken up and developed and made me rather famous, but not as famous as I would become later. One was the hand grenade. I developed the first prototype of the hand grenade. And the second thing was the breech block breech system of a carbide for Sharp's carbide, which became standard issue for the Army for many years. After the war, I returned to Waltham, Massachusetts, and faced a major decision in 1866. At that point, I was approached by several people to move to Elgin, Illinois and start up a new watch company. As you know, I took that opportunity. I made the decision to come to Elgin, moved here in 1867, and was one of the first workers in the watch company. Was here when the first timepiece was produced, and was here for 16 years after that as foreman of the screw department. During that time, I was also a city alderman for 2 years, and I believe I lived on Division Street. That's the best my information tells me. So that was where my house was located. But back to 1882, I faced an important decision in my life. I had been with the watch company for 16 years, very successful, but I was deciding whether or not I should go off on my own. I was continually coming up with ideas that I wanted to pursue. And in that year, I decided to take a leave from the watch company and pursue one of my dreams, or one of my inventions, and it was called the tubular tower system. You can see, tubular iron tower. That's the correct name of it. There's a rough prototype here, but more importantly, as you leave and you walk past the table, take a look at the photograph. That's a photograph of one of my towers. It was taken in downtown Elgin in the 1880s. It's actually a Fountain Square Plaza. What this was a tall, 80 to 100 foot tall tower that would take advantage of the recently invented electricity and use that through arc lighting, which was a predecessor to the incandescent light we have now, but used arc lighting to illuminate several blocks around a tower. I pursued that dream. I set up a company in Detroit, actually, and the first city in the nation to have illumination, electrical illumination, and the first city to use my system was Aurora, Illinois, just downriver, and is still known as the City of Lights. I pursued that dream through Detroit, Indianapolis, and it took me more and more away from Elgin. I spent less and less time here until 1889, when I moved back to New Orleans, the city I had helped rebuild during the Civil War, and spent the last 5 years of my life there installing one of these systems in New Orleans, and then running what I became what now would be called the head of public works in the city. I died in New Orleans on April 25th, 1894. And because most of my children were still in Elgin or in this area, I was brought back here and buried in this cemetery. My kids went on, were very famous in their own right, or pioneers in their own right, my kids and my grandkids. I had a child that opened the first Ford dealership in town. I had a child that created the Adams bike and manufactured those for several years. One of my children helped develop the steamline trains that developed into the Zephyrs and the stainless steel trains. And I had another child that was a promoter of the first automobile race that was held in 1895. My grandkids, one was a chairman of the board of the Leith Furniture Company in town. Other things to note in my family is I am the great-grandson of Samuel Adams, signer of the Declaration of Independence, a famous revolutionary. And I also currently have a great-grandson who is named after me, John Spencer Adams, in his 60s, living in South Elgin, so they're still family members, local. But I think it was a good decision to make in 1882, and I became well known nationwide for my tubular iron towers that illuminated cities. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to read a passage from the new book of etiquette regarding funerals. There is no more eloquent commentary on the vanity of human wishes than the pomp and ceremony which, since the first syllable of recorded time, have attended funeral services. Kings and emperors have erected splendid mausoleums in which they and their families might be buried. Pharaohs have kept slaves at work a lifetime on pyramids beneath which their bones might crumble comfortably to rest. Savages in lonely jungles have erected mounds to protect their lifeless bodies. Great mounds for great chiefs. Mounds rich with treasures of beads and pottery to be carried into the next world. For man has always feared death and wondered about it. It is the great unknown, the mystery that knows no solution. Where does man go? What does he do and see when he vanishes into the long silence? Does he live again? Can he return to earth again? Or is he just gone? For centuries, man lived in fear of that great unknown. In ancient times, man so feared the dead that he painted his body black in an effort to hide from the deceased, keeping constant vigil, afraid that the dead would enter the body of the living. After a time, man draped himself in black cloth in an effort to hide from the spirits. So from the beginning of recorded time, black has been associated with death. Today we consider black to be the traditional color of mourning, a sign of respect for the deceased. The mourning traditions familiar to us today stem from those early ancient customs. But it was Queen Victoria who had the greatest influence on mourning traditions. In 1861, after her beloved Albert died, leaving her with 8 children, a widow at the age of 42, Victoria wore nothing but black for the rest of her days. From that time on, there have been strict written rules of etiquette regarding mourning. The first rule dictates the length of time a widow is expected to observe mourning is 2 years. The first period of deep mourning lasts 1 year and 1 day. During that time, a widow is expected to wear widow's weeds, or black clothing, free of decoration other than black jet. No gold or silver is to be worn. The skirt is covered with black crepe. The body and sleeves of the dress are trimmed with crepe. A hat with a veil covering the face is worn when time permits that a widow re-enters society. That time period varies due to circumstances, but it is usually the first full year. After 9 months, it is acceptable for the veil to be worn trailing down the back. Widow's weeds were to be made of bombazine, Henrietta, or Melrose. But as these fabrics are not readily available today, silk, wool, or cotton are acceptable choices. Satin is never used for widow's weeds due to the sheen of the fabric. Furs are not to be worn during the first year of mourning. Black stockings and shoes along with black kid gloves are worn, so the whole body is covered, a throwback to ancient times. If a widow does not own a black dress, she must immediately visit her dressmaker. If finances are prohibitive, a dress can be dyed black. We are told it is not necessary to have expensive mourning if our means will not permit it. We should learn to suit our requirements to the state of our purses. Following the first year of mourning, a widow begins a period of half mourning, and she can wear either gray or purple. The hat and veil are no longer mandatory. The crepe is removed. Fur can be worn, but only dark furs such as sealskin or astrakhan. Mourning etiquette for a man is less restrictive. The accepted period of time for mourning is usually 3 months. A man is expected to wear a black suit or a dark suit with a black armband. If a man sports a cane, a black ribbon can be tied around the cane. Children who have lost a loved one are not expected to dress entirely in black. Their clothing is trimmed in black, and of course they are seen and not heard. The period of mourning varies depending on the relationship of the deceased. For parents-in-law, black is worn for 1 month, after which black and white with lilac should follow. For grandparents, black with a touch of crepe is worn for 3 months. For sister or brother, 6 months is the usual time of mourning. Crepe covering for 3 months, plain black for 2, and half mourning for 1 month. Uncles, aunts, nieces, and nephews, plain black with jet is worn for 3 months. After a woman brushed her hair, she would save that hair in a hair receiver. The hair was then brushed again and washed and could be woven into hair jewelry. This was a very common practice in the 19th century, and the hair jewelry wasn't really associated with mourning until the end of the Victorian era. At the time of the Civil War, when a man went off to war, he gave his loved one a lock of his hair. That lock of hair was kept in a golden locket. If he didn't return from the war, the lock of hair was transferred to a locket of black. Hair was also woven into shapes, flowers and leaves, usually things to do with nature. And then those pieces were woven into a mourning wreath, and it was usually displayed with the picture of the deceased in the center. Watch fobs were a very common article made of hair, and I have a couple examples here of hair woven into watch fobs, and you're welcome to come up and look at them if you like. I thank you for listening.